The sentence, "You're coming with me," said the solitary rancher to the woman broken for giving birth to triplet girls. Wyoming Territory, late January 1877. Stoker Peak of the Shadowhorn Mountains. The wind was not merely howling, it was a screaming gale, a wounded, monstrous thing, tearing at the high granite ridges. The air itself was a weapon, carrying shards of ice that bit exposed skin, stinging the eyes and stealing the breath. For Elias Vance, a man whose life was calibrated to the mountain's harsh, unforgiving rhythm, the sound of the wind was a dull, constant percussion, a backdrop to his solitude. It was the sudden, sharp, high-pitched wail of something smaller, more fragile, that first snagged his attention, cutting through the blizzard's roar like a single, desperate flute note played just above the threshold of sanity. Elias, a shadow wrapped in elk hide and worn denim, pulled his weary Mustang, Kestrel, to a halt. The snow beneath Kestrel's iron hooves packed down with a reluctant, brittle crunch that was instantly silenced by the next sweep of the gale. Elias tilted his head, the fur-lined hood of his coat shifting, orienting himself toward the faint timberline, a stretch of skeletal pines clinging tenaciously to the cliff face. He was not looking for trouble. He was merely trying to outrun the worst of the afternoon's deepening storm front, seeking the lee of the high rocks. There it was again. A baby's cry. No, a chorus of them. Thin, impossibly weak, yet imbued with a terrifying primal urgency that chilled Elias far deeper than the ambient temperature. He knew the sounds of the mountain, the screech of a hunting owl, the distant crack of splitting ice, the snort of a wild elk. This sound was wrong. It was human desperation, stark and unforgivable, miles from any settlement. He narrowed his eyes, the cold air stinging his vision, making the world feel like a shifting canvas of white and gray. No honest traveler rode this path, particularly not in a storm this deep. He dismounted, the heavy movement of his boots sinking ankle-deep in the fresh powder. The path he was on, an old, almost forgotten logging trace, hadn't been touched in days. It was a line of forgotten history, cutting through the dense, snow-laden trees like a freshly healed scar. Leading Kestrel by the reins, Elias moved forward. His internal clock was ticking mercilessly. Exposure at this altitude was measured in minutes, not hours. His breath, sharp and visible, plumed out in puffs that vanished instantly. He listened, his entire being tuned to the faint, heartbreaking sound, his grip tightening on the heavy reins. He felt the familiar, protective weight of the Winchester rifle sheathed on Kestrel's saddle, a silent reassurance in a world that offered none. The cries grew louder, leading him to a small, desolate clearing near an ancient crooked fence post, half rotted, half buried in a drift that swallowed the post up to the first wire. The clearing was an anomaly, a forgotten patch of ranch land from decades past. And there she was. A woman, so frail she seemed to be defying the laws of physics, stood where no human should be able to stand. She was tied cruelly to the post, with barbed wire, the rusting, cruel metal biting deep into her forearms, securing her arms behind her back in an excruciating bind. Her skin was already torn, wrists bleeding sluggishly onto the virginal white snow. Ice clung to the fringe of her lashes and the edges of her matted hair, which was frozen stiff to the post, anchoring her against the wind's torment. Her lips were cracked and bruised, her face pale as sun-bleached bone, save for the horrifying violet-black bruises blooming across her cheekbones and jaw. A grotesque, vivid signature of violence. At her feet lay 3 small bundles, impossibly tiny, the cloth stiff with frost. Infants, newborns, perhaps no older than a day. One whimpered weakly, a sound that tore at the silence between gusts. The other 2 lay eerily still, swaddled in what appeared to be the torn and shredded remains of a white nightgown. The woman's head moved slightly, a painful, slow adjustment that required monumental effort. She was conscious, barely clinging to the edge of awareness, a candle wick flickering in the heart of the storm. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered, the words rasping, catching and immediately dissolving in the wind. It was not a plea for rescue, but a final, desperate command of a mother's will. Elias dropped instantly to one knee, the wet snow instantly soaking the heavy fabric of his trousers. He ignored the woman's extensive visible wounds for a moment, his priority the immediate crisis, the sheer fragility of the infants. He pulled off his thick elk-hide gloves and checked each bundle. They were breathing, shallow, steady enough, but their skin was dangerously cold, the kind of deep cold that seemed to travel into the very marrow of the bone, shutting down life slowly, deliberately. He returned his gaze to her, meeting eyes that were vast pools of pain and desperate flickering hope. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention, completely devoid of question or doubt. His certainty was the first solid thing she had encountered in days, perhaps years. She blinked slowly, the effort of processing his words visible in the slackening of her bruised jaw. Elias produced a worn hunting knife from the sheath inside his boot. With swift, precise movements honed by a decade of trapping and survival, he sliced through the thick coils of barbed wire. The rusted steel had bitten deep. Blood welled immediately as the tension was released, the rusty taint mixing instantly with the pristine white snow. But she did not scream. She did not even flinch. The moment the wire was cut, her legs gave out, betraying her. Elias dropped the knife and wrapped a thick, protective arm around her waist, catching her, holding her steady against the cruel pull of gravity. Her body was terrifyingly limp, heavy with exhaustion, cold, and severe blood loss. Elias didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, a bundle of bruised flesh and fragile life, cradling her against his broad chest. Her coldness radiated through his coat. The fierce mountain man felt an unexpected, sharp pang of rage for the man who had done this. The babies were next. One by one, he gathered the tiny, silent bundles. He tucked the smallest lilac firmly against his coat, securing the 3 infants using a thick, woven wool blanket pulled from Kestrel's saddlebag. They barely stirred, conserved by the brutal cold. The wind picked up, a ferocious slicing sound across the open clearing. Elias shielded them all with his body as best he could, turning his broad back to the gale. Kestrel, anxious but obedient, nickered softly nearby. Elias glanced toward the snow-choked horizon. The climb back to his solitary cabin was a grueling half-mile uphill through the unrelenting blizzard. He adjusted his grip on the woman, the now identified Seraphina Thorne, and tightened the wrapping on the infants. They were his responsibility now. He didn't speak to her or to the babies, but rather into the tempestuous void, maybe to the wind itself, maybe to the unforgiving mountain, or maybe to God. "You don't die here," he whispered, his voice a promise and a threat. "Not on my land, not today." He mounted Kestrel with practiced, deliberate care, settling Seraphina in front of him, the babies tucked securely between them. She weighed almost nothing. The infants were literally lighter than winter rabbits. The cold had been a relentless thief, draining their strength to the point of extinction. Time was their most ferocious enemy, ticking down the precious moments before hypothermia claimed them. The trail back was agonizingly slow, the blizzard relentless, but Elias moved without pause, focusing Kestrel with low, sharp commands. There was no time for questions, not who she was, not who was the monster who had done this, not what demons chased her across the high plains. There was only time enough to keep them alive. The cabin was dark and eerily still when they finally reached it. The fire, which Elias always banked for the morning, had long since died to cold ash. Elias kicked the door open, the sound muffled by the thick logs, carried Seraphina straight inside, and laid her gently on a thick bed of piled wool quilts near the hearth. The babies followed, placed in a woven basket lined with soft rabbit pelts. He turned to the hearth, his hands moving with quiet, focused speed. He stoked the fire, not with shaking hands, but with an almost surgical certainty. Outside, the snow continued its fierce descent, silently and swiftly covering the tracks that led to the scene of her pain, erasing the evidence of cruelty. Inside, Elias worked in the low, quickly growing firelight, silent, focused, and utterly determined. The cabin was little more than 4 walls of rough-hewn timber and a deeply sloped roof groaning under the immense weight of the snowpack. But it was dry, and the warmth that Elias Vance now urged from the hearth began to crawl outward, pushing back the clinging, insidious cold. Elias moved with a quiet, efficient silence, every action purposeful. He hung his soaked coat by the fire and peeled off his gloves, revealing hands that were calloused, cracked, and eternally weathered, the hands of a man who fought the elements daily and knew how to be gentle only by necessity. Seraphina lay still, her breathing barely discernible. Her forearms were loosely wrapped in the strips of linen he had torn from an old shirt. She had not stirred since they arrived. The triplets, Clara, Blythe, and Lilac, had begun to stir, low, weak whimpers escaping their tiny mouths. They were alive, and that was the immediate victory. Elias filled an iron pot with goat's milk from a stone jug he kept tucked away. He set it on the fire to warm, the scent of the dairy a comforting, homely anchor in the raw tension of the room. He found a small, smooth feeding spoon carved from pine and set it beside a tin bowl. Then he crossed to the woman. Her breathing was frighteningly shallow. He dipped a clean cloth into a pail of warm water, wrung it out, and began the slow, gentle process of cleaning the dried, encrusted blood from her legs. The bruises ran deep, mean, and purple-black along her shins and ankles. Someone had kicked her hard, viciously, and often. Her knees were scraped raw. The sight of such targeted brutality stiffened his resolve. He worked with an impersonal, protective tenderness, dipping, wiping, and finally covering her legs again with the edge of the blanket. She did not wake. When the milk warmed, he tested it on the sensitive skin of his wrist. Still too hot. He waited, his attention drawn to the smallest baby, Lilac, who had started to cry in earnest. Thin, urgent whimpers that spoke of hunger. He crouched beside the makeshift cradle. Their skin was warm again, a profound, life-affirming sign. Using the small spoon, Elias fed tiny sips into Lilac's mouth. She took it clumsily at first, then with a fierce, newborn greed that spoke of an essential refusal to surrender. He repeated the process with Clara and Blythe, pausing only to wipe their mouths and secure the blankets closer around their small heads. A faint sound from the bed drew his attention. Seraphina stirred, her eyelids fluttering like leaves in a sudden downdraft. Her voice, when it came, was cracked, barely audible, a dry, brittle sound. "My name's Seraphina Thorne." Elias stood and crossed the room in 2 strides. He crouched beside her. "Elias," he said simply, offering only his first name, the only thing that mattered now. Her lips moved again, but no sound followed. Her gaze slipped past him to the babies, who now rested quietly, their faces illuminated by the fire's soft glow. One of them, Clara, sneezed, a startling, healthy sound. Seraphina's eyes filled instantly with tears, but she did not sob. Not truly, only a silent, unstoppable stream of warmth down her cracked cheeks. Her body was too tired, too broken to afford the luxury of a full, purging cry. It was the tears of pure, shocked relief. Elias rose and walked to the back of the room. From a storage trunk, he pulled an old, thick fur cloak, elk-hide lined with rabbit fur, an inheritance from his father. He folded it carefully and brought it to the basket, placing it beneath the sleeping children. It made the cradle warmer, softer, more secure. When he looked back, Seraphina was watching him. He offered a slow, steady nod and returned to the hearth to add more wood. Sparks rose like fireflies and vanished into the smoke-stained rafters. Time passed in quiet obedience. The only sounds were the pop of the wood fire, the slow, distant wind, and the synchronous, shifting breath of 4 bodies slowly returning from the very precipice of death. Later, as Elias fed the fire one last time, before allowing himself a few hours of rest, he heard her voice again. This time, it was firmer, not strong, but imbued with absolute certainty. "You didn't leave us." He didn't reply immediately. He only sat by the fire, staring into the bright, consuming heat as the snow howled against the walls and the cruel cold beyond was held at bay. For now, they were safe. He knew this was not a matter of charity or duty. It was a matter of fundamental principle. He had saved them, and he would keep them safe. The storm outside had softened to a hush, a heavy stillness that wrapped around the cabin. Snow still fell in light curtains, but the wind was dead. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, casting warm flickers across the timber walls. Seraphina lay propped against folded blankets. Her face had regained a touch of color, though the bruises still bloomed beneath her skin like ink stains left by a careless, cruel hand. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from cold and the unspoken screaming, but she could speak now, recounting her ordeal. Elias sat nearby, sharpening a hunting blade against a wet stone with slow, careful strokes. He hadn't asked her anything. That silence in its own way was a profound kindness. "I was 17 when I married Victor Thorne," Seraphina began suddenly, her voice quiet but clear in the hush. "He was 34, wealthy, powerful. My father said I was lucky. I thought I was lucky too at first. He brought me to a grand house in the lowlands, tall windows, marble floors. I wore silk. I slept on feather pillows. But he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly, not gently." She paused, glancing at the sleeping babies beside the fire. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm, 3 small miracles of defiance. When the midwife announced the first daughter, Clara, he frowned. When the second, Blythe, arrived, he stopped speaking to me entirely. When the third, Lilac, was born, her voice cracked, the small rupture of a profound wound. He called the midwife a sorceress and said she cursed the womb. He told his brothers I was no better than a mule, useless if I couldn't give him a son to inherit his land and name. That night, they beat me. She turned her face slightly, revealing a faint white scar along her jawline, an old wound now contrasted against the fresh bruises. I thought he might kill me, but instead, he dragged me to that old fence post and tied me there with the wire he used to keep his cattle penned in. He said, "If the snow does not take you, then you are meant to live in shame." He called it justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke, automatically reaching toward the basket holding her daughters. "They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed." Elias set the blade down slowly. The scratching sound of steel on stone ceased, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire. He did not speak right away. His jaw flexed once, tightly, containing a sudden surge of cold fury. Then he stood and walked toward her. His boots made no sound on the cabin floor. He knelt beside her cot and reached for her hand. It was swollen and bruised, the knuckles scabbed and scarred by the wire. He took it as if it were made of glass, holding it gently in his large, weathered palm. He met her gaze. His eyes, the color of winter ice, were calm, steady, and certain. "Here," he said, his voice low, a deep, resonating tone. "Your girls are the only thing worth feeding in this whole valley." Seraphina's eyes flooded again, but this time, the tears were not of pain or fear, but of absolute release. She let them fall silently down her cheeks, mixing with the warmth of the firelight. Elias stayed kneeling beside her, his hand clasped gently around hers. His presence was quiet and grounding, a mountain's unmoving strength. Outside, the snow kept falling, purifying the landscape. Inside, something deeper than survival had shifted. The next few days were a blur of recovery. Elias did not leave the cabin, except for essential firewood and water, the blizzard keeping the outside world at bay, a temporary gift of isolation. He had moved his own simple bedroll closer to the door, serving as a silent sentinel. Seraphina began to move, tentatively at first. She was weak, the cold having stolen her strength, but her will was a granite core. She learned the rhythms of the tiny cabin. The best time to check the fire, the way Elias kept the kindling dry, the quiet sounds the girls made just before they woke. Elias taught her how to mix the warm goat's milk with a small amount of rendered elk fat, a trick learned from a Ute woman years ago, to give the babies the nourishment they needed to fight the chill. Seraphina watched him constantly, cataloging his movements, his routines. He was not a soft man, but his care was meticulous, almost sacred. He treated the infant's helplessness with a fierce, unwavering respect. One evening, Seraphina was strong enough to sit up unassisted for a long period. Elias was carving small, precise wooden pegs for a repair. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "Anyone else would have left me and taken the children to the nearest settlement. They would have gone to Victor." Elias paused his carving, running his thumb over the smooth cedar. He didn't look up. "They were tied to my land," he said, his voice gruff. "And you were tied to them. On this mountain, you only get one chance at life. The man who tied you there had already taken yours. I wasn't going to let him steal it again." He finally met her gaze. "Some things you fight for, Seraphina. You don't ask for permission, you just fight." Seraphina swallowed. That was the first true counsel she had received in her adult life. Her marriage to Victor Thorne had been a cage of silk and promises that withered into betrayal and cruelty. Victor was a man obsessed with legacy and lineage, demanding sons to carry his name and land. The birth of Clara, Blythe, and Lilac, 3 daughters, was a triple failure in his eyes, an insult to his masculine pride, which he punished with a terrible, calculated brutality. As the snow outside melted, the mountain revealed its true self, rugged and beautiful. Seraphina realized Elias's silence was his armor and his truth. He did not speak unless it was necessary, and when he did, the words were like stones, heavy, solid, and dependable. She spent an hour cleaning the cabin's single, small window, scraping away the frozen condensation until she could see the world outside, a vast, snow-covered landscape stretching toward the jagged peaks. It was beautiful, but terrifyingly isolated. "What will you do when spring comes?" she asked, breaking a long silence. Elias was oiling his rifle. "Keep working, keep hunting, keep the fire banked." He looked at the babies, now sleeping side by side, their faces plump and healthy. "We'll be here." "He won't stop," Seraphina whispered, her voice tightening. "Victor, he thinks I'm his property. The girls are his property. He will send men when the road's clear." Elias snapped the rifle shut. The sound was sharp and final. "Then we'll be waiting." Elias has chosen defiance, but Victor Thorne's shadow looms large. The coming spring will bring not only thaw, but also Victor's hired guns. How would you prepare for a confrontation against a wealthy, ruthless man who believes he is above the law? Would you rely on strategy or sheer force? Spring unfurled slowly across the mountainside, an agonizingly slow transition from white death to green life, softening the snowpack and coaxing green buds from bare branches. The days stretched longer, and the cabin, once a mere refuge against death's chill, began to feel almost like a living, breathing home. Seraphina moved with quiet purpose now. Her steps no longer staggered. She no longer flinched when the wind blew or when wood cracked unexpectedly beneath the fire. She had taken to cooking small meals, simple, nourishing things, stew made from pine roots, wild onions, and whatever Elias brought back from the woods. The 3 babies, Clara, Blythe, and Lilac, grew stronger by the week. Their cheeks plumped, their cries grew louder, sweeter, like birds just learning how to sing. Mornings were the quietest. Seraphina would rise before the sun, tend to the fire, and check the girls. Elias would already be gone, out hunting or checking traps. He never left a note, but always returned before dusk. Their conversation stayed sparse, not cold, just gentle, like 2 people learning the intricate language of each other's silence. Small comforts began to take root. One afternoon, Seraphina found Elias at the workbench outside the cabin. His coat was off, the sleeves of his flannel shirt rolled up, revealing weathered forearms corded with muscle. He held a carving knife and a thin plank of cedar. She watched in silence as he worked, whittling each piece with quiet, meditative precision. Later that night, she saw what he had made. 3 wooden plaques, each no longer than a handspan, hung above the baby's resting place. They bore 3 names in neat, deeply carved script: Clara, Blythe, Lilac. Each letter had been carefully smoothed, the wood oiled so that it caught the firelight. Seraphina pressed her fingers to her mouth. No one had ever carved her daughter's names into anything permanent. Now they hung over their heads like small, solid prayers. The days turned gold and green. Seraphina began to sing to the girls in the evenings, soft lullabies she remembered from childhood. Elias would sit by the door, his long frame leaned against the jamb, sharpening tools or polishing his rifle, always listening. It was just after dawn, on a day where the sun finally felt warm, that the knock came. Elias opened the door to find a woman, bundled in a green wool shawl, breath fogging slightly in the morning air. Her name was Anya, a freighter's widow, who sometimes rode the edges of the territory, carrying mail and gossip. Her cheeks were flushed from the desperate ride up the mountain, and her horse, tied to a nearby pine, still twitched from exertion. "Morning, Elias," Anya said, her voice clipped and urgent. "Anya," he greeted, stepping aside. "Come in." Seraphina was sitting near the fire, holding Clara. Anya gave her a quick, assessing glance, then turned to Elias as he shut the door. "It's about her," Anya whispered, leaning in. "Victor Thorne has put out word. He's telling everyone she ran off in a fit, that she's unstable. Says the babies are his by right, and she's keeping them in secret against the law. Seraphina's eyes widened, her fingers instantly clenching around Clara. The old fear, sharp and cold, returned. He's hired men, Anya continued, lowering her voice further. 4 of them. They claim they're just looking to bring a mother back where she belongs. No questions asked. But the way they ride Elias, it ain't no rescue party. They ride like butchers. Elias nodded once. That was all. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the glowing hearth. Anya looked between them. I rode up soon as I heard. They'll find this place. This cabin isn't a secret forever. They won't take her, Elias stated, his voice flat and final. Anya hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Dried lentils, jerky, and a flask of spirits, she said. You'll need it. I told them you were 2 days' ride further north, but they'll check here eventually. He accepted it with a silent nod, recognizing the risk she had taken. She left not long after, urging her horse back down the trail. The rest of the day passed in frantic, silent motion. Elias repaired the latch on the rear window with heavy iron and reinforced the door with a second crossbar, a thick timber beam that could be dropped into place against the jamb. He stacked firewood near the hearth so Seraphina would not need to venture outside. He moved his meager store of food and water to the root cellar, carving a hidden compartment near the deepest wall in case they needed to hide or flee quickly. He did not speak much. He sharpened his hunting knife, a long curved blade he called Sentinel, until its edge gleamed like silver. Then he slid it into the sheath on his belt and kept it there. He checked and rechecked his Winchester, cleaning every joint and chamber until it was flawlessly functional. When night came, they slept lightly. The next morning, the air changed again. It was too quiet. Even the robins had hushed. Then came the sound, not of one horse, but 4 sets of hooves, muffled by the dew-soaked earth, approaching slowly, deliberately. Seraphina clutched her daughters close, her heart hammering a wild, uncontrolled rhythm against her ribs. Elias opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. The riders were approaching slowly, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They reined in a few yards from the front steps. The man in front, tall and mean-looking, had a scar down one cheek and a prominent ivory-handled revolver at his side. He was clearly the leader. "Elias Vance," the leader called out, his voice gritty. "We come with claim. That woman inside is Victor Thorne's wife. She's his property. We've got every right to retrieve her and them girls." Elias stood absolutely still, arms loose at his sides, unarmed, save for the knife concealed at his waist. His voice was calm, clear, cutting through the morning stillness. "She was never his," Elias said, "and she sure as hell ain't yours." The man sneered, shifting in his saddle. "You think this is over, Mountain Man? Thorne wants his property back. We'll take her, dead or alive." Elias didn't blink. "You want to test that? Come back and try." The 4 riders stared at him in silence for a beat too long, sensing something dangerous and unyielding in the solitary man's composure. Then the lead one tugged on his reins. "Let's go," he barked. "Not worth it today, but we'll be back with paperwork." They rode off without another word, their eyes promising a return, a reckoning. Elias stood at the threshold for a long time after they vanished, a sentinel carved from granite. Inside, Seraphina exhaled slowly, still clutching her daughters. They were safe for now, but the shadows from the lowlands were not done reaching up the mountain. The initial threat has passed, but it was a mere skirmish. Victor Thorne will not accept defeat, especially after being embarrassed by Elias Vance. The fight is coming. What is the single most important lesson Seraphina must teach her daughters about survival in this harsh world? And how does Elias embody that lesson? The following weeks were an exercise in constant vigilance and quiet trust. Elias used his knowledge of the mountain to prepare. He set up tripwires near the main paths, not to injure, but to alert. He carved shallow, concealed trenches on the north slope to monitor movements below. Seraphina, recognizing that hiding was temporary, began learning how to contribute to their defense. Elias taught her how to hold the heavy Winchester steady, how to aim for the center mass, how to reload quickly. She learned to load the ancient single-shot pistol he carried, a gift from Anya, and kept it under the girl's cradle. "You have to be ready," Elias instructed one evening, his tone pragmatic. not cruel. Not for them. For yourself. For the girls. I'm ready, she whispered, her hands, once soft and privileged, now calloused from labor and firm around the cold steel. But their relationship was built on more than just defense. They shared the rhythm of raising the girls. Elias, awkward at first, learned how to change a diaper fashioned from soft flannel scraps. He learned to distinguish Clara's demanding cry from Blythe's soft whimpers or Lilac's gurgling contentment. One afternoon, Seraphina caught Elias humming softly to Lilac, bouncing her gently on his knee while he polished the brass lamp. The tune was an old, forgotten ballad about a high-ridge hermit. She smiled, a full, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, and the sight of it made Elias pause, slightly startled by its sudden, radiant warmth. "My mother used to hum that," she murmured. "My father," Elias replied simply, "taught it to me when I was still small enough to ride in his lap." That night, Seraphina dreamt not of Victor's cruelty, but of the mountain, vast, cold, but solid, a place that held her and her daughters secure. The full attack came late in the season, just as the mountain burst into full bloom. The air was thick with the scent of wild lilac and pine resin. Elias had ridden out at dawn to check a distant trap line. He was still 3 miles from the cabin when he heard the faint, distant crack of gunfire, not the booming sound of a hunting rifle, but the sharp, flat report of a pistol. Victor Thorne had not sent 4 men this time. He had brought a small army. Elias spurred Kestrel hard, pushing the Mustang faster than he ever had on the treacherous slopes. His mind raced. Seraphina, the girls, the pistol. At the cabin, Seraphina heard the first shots, closer than before, and more numerous. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She grabbed the single-shot pistol, its grip warm in her sweating palm, and moved to the back window. The men had split into 2 groups, one distracting from the front, another moving around the back to block any escape via the creek trail. Peeking through a crack in the door, she saw him, Victor Thorne himself. He was dressed in expensive tailored riding gear, looking utterly out of place against the rough timber and the wild mountain air. He carried a double-barrel shotgun, held like a toy. He had brought 2 deputies from the lowland town with him, paid for, not sworn, and 4 brutal-looking ranch hands. "Seraphina!" Victor's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the clearing. "You have committed an outrage. Return what is mine, and I will be merciful." Seraphina moved toward the crib, where Clara, Blythe, and Lilac were beginning to stir, sensing the disturbance. She pressed herself against the cold timber wall. She knew the root cellar was too visible now. "Mercy is what you denied me!" she screamed back, her voice startlingly strong, fueled by months of banked fury and absolute protective instinct. Victor laughed, a dry, high sound devoid of humor. "You have nowhere to run, foolish woman. I will simply take what's mine, and the man who housed you will hang for kidnapping." Just then, a commotion erupted on the far side of the clearing. Elias had arrived, not by the main trail, but by a hidden, steep path known only to him. He was on foot, having tied Kestrel miles back to prevent noise. He moved like a ghost through the pines, his rifle now resting against his shoulder. He didn't engage Victor. He engaged the threat. The 2 paid deputies were moving to flank the cabin. Elias's first shot cracked the stillness, sharp and impossibly loud. The first deputy dropped, screaming, clutching his leg. The second scrambled for cover behind a massive granite boulder. Victor spun, enraged, realizing the odds had changed. "Find him! Kill him! Don't let him escape!" The ranch hands, hardened but not soldiers, began to scatter, seeking cover. The battle became a chaotic game of survival. Elias moved, firing carefully, never wasting a bullet, forcing them to stay pinned down. Inside, Seraphina knew this was their chance. Elias was drawing fire, but he couldn't hold them all. She waited for a momentary lull, a shift in the wind, a loud command from Victor. Now. She kicked out the back window latch, shattering the brittle glass. She snatched the fur cloak and the last of the provisions. She secured Clara to her back, holding Blythe and Lilac in her arms. The weight was agonizing, but she pushed through the pain, fueled by Elias's sacrifice. She slipped out, heading not for the main creek, which Victor would watch, but up the near-vertical goat path Elias had shown her, a treacherous hidden route known only to him. As she scrambled up the wet rock face, the pistol clutched in her hand, she paused only once, looking back at the cabin, where the scent of gunpowder and the shouts of angry men filled the air. She saw Elias, a brief glimpse of him running across the clearing, drawing Victor's men away from her escape route. He was bleeding, a dark stain on his flannel shirt near his side. But he was moving. He was sacrificing himself so they could live. Seraphina did not stop until she reached the high meadow, a hidden plateau where the air was thin, and the noise of the valley battle was just a dull echo. She laid the girls down in the tall grass, checking them. Safe. She looked at the pistol in her hand. Elias's instructions echoed, "You don't ask for permission, you just fight." She had two options: continue climbing, gain a day's head start, and seek the distant Fort Russell, or turn back. If she went forward, Elias would certainly be captured or killed. Victor would find them eventually, with the law or without. Seraphina knew Victor's greatest weakness, his obsession with legitimacy. He had to appear righteous. He would never admit to hiring guns to kill a rancher in broad daylight. She took a deep, steadying breath of the pine-scented air. She looked at her three daughters, Clara, Blythe, Lilac, their innocent faces upturned to the sky. She turned around. Instead of hiding, Seraphina followed the high ridge, cutting across the western slope, racing toward the lowlands using the shortest, quickest route she and Elias had planned in case of a need to reach civilization fast. She had been heading for Anya's relay point. She ran until the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows. She found Anya preparing for dinner, her small, sturdy cabin tucked into a ravine. Anya saw Seraphina, wild-eyed, bruised, carrying 3 babies, and didn't ask a single question. "Victor Thorne is at the cabin. Elias is fighting them off," Seraphina gasped, her chest burning. "You have to get the sheriff. Tell him Victor is attempting murder and kidnapping. Tell him I'm alive. I have to go back." Anya didn't argue. She scooped up a rifle, handed Seraphina a fresh canteen and a piece of dried meat, and helped settle the girls with a neighbor. "Sheriff Mather is tough but fair. I'll be back with him before dawn." Seraphina left immediately, running back up the mountain trail, her heart now a weapon of pure resolve. She arrived back at the clearing just before midnight. The fighting was over. The clearing was silent, save for the wind. The cabin door was splintered. A dark circle of dried blood stained the porch, but the building was intact. She crept forward, knife drawn, the sound of her own breath deafening. She found Elias inside. He was slumped against the wall near the hearth, his rifle abandoned on the floor. His eyes were closed, his breathing labored. The dark stain on his shirt was much larger now, and his face was pale with shock and pain. Victor and his men were gone. "Elias!" Seraphina dropped the knife and rushed to him, dropping to her knees, examining the wound. It was a shallow graze near his ribcage, but he had lost a lot of blood and was exhausted. Where are the girls?" he rasped, his eyes barely opening. "Safe. Anya has them. I went for the sheriff." He managed a faint, tired smile. "Knew you'd come back." "You're not dying," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You hear me? You stood between us and hell, Elias Vance. I am not going to bury the only man who ever truly protected me." She stripped her skirt and began tearing it into strips to staunch the bleeding. Just then, they heard the sound of hooves. Too many for one man. Elias tried to sit up. "They're back." "No," Seraphina said, listening carefully. "That's Anya and the sheriff." Sheriff Mather, a broad, stern man known for his unflinching fairness, rode into the clearing, flanked by 2 armed deputies. Anya was beside him, pointing toward the cabin. Seraphina stepped out, covered in dust and blood, but standing tall. "Seraphina Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice grave. "Are you well?" "I am alive, Sheriff. And the man inside, Elias Vance, saved my life and the lives of my daughters from Victor Thorne. Victor is the criminal. He shot Elias and tried to murder us all for the sin of bearing daughters." Mather's eyes narrowed. "Where is Thorne?" "They rode out hours ago," Elias grunted from inside. "He will be found," Mather promised. The sheriff took down Seraphina's testimony, written in the low light of the hearth. She detailed the abuse, the 3 births, the abandonment, and the attempted murder, confirming Elias's protection at every turn. By morning, the sheriff and his men were gone, riding to the lowland to arrest Victor Thorne and his thugs on charges of assault, attempted murder, and conspiracy. Elias was left in Seraphina's care. The storm had passed, and the worst of the wounds had begun to heal, on skin, in memory, and in the growing trust between Elias and Seraphina. Elias's shoulder and side mended slowly. Seraphina helped him bandage the wound each day with calm, steady hands. He never complained, she never fussed. Life had taken a cruel, near-fatal turn, and yet, here they were, still breathing, still moving, still building something from what remained. News filtered up the mountain weeks later. Victor Thorne had been arrested. The testimony of the paid deputies, combined with Seraphina's account and the physical evidence at the post and the cabin, was enough. He was stripped of his land and wealth, the very things he obsessed over, and imprisoned. Seraphina Thorne was free, truly free. With the danger behind them, they rebuilt the cabin together. What had once been a battered shelter for survival was now becoming a home. Elias extended the east wall to make room for a larger hearth and an actual kitchen area. Seraphina painted the shutters a faded green using leftover pigment from an old can Anya had brought up from town. They decided to open their doors to travelers. There were always men on the trade trail, fur traders, timber haulers, ranch hands riding from one county to the next. Word spread that a hot stew and a safe night's sleep could be found near the ridge just below the second switchback. They called it the Hearth at Vance Ridge. Seraphina cooked meals that warmed the stomach and softened the heart. Venison stew, root vegetable hash, and sweet cornbread with honey. Elias hunted, chopped wood, maintained the stables, and made sure no trouble ever crossed the porch. The three girls grew fast. Clara walked first, a determined, steady gait. Blythe said her first word, fire. Lilac sang before she spoke, a high, clear melody. Guests came and went, and with each passing day, laughter began to echo more often inside the cabin. One evening, after the last rider had left and the girls were asleep in their warm, fur-lined cradle, Seraphina stepped out to find Elias on the porch, sanding down a rough plank of new-cut timber. The sun was sinking into the hills, casting the world in a wash of gold and lavender. He looked up at her, reached into a satchel by his feet, and pulled something out. It was a shawl, thick and hand-woven, dyed deep burgundy with dark thread embroidery. On one corner, in careful, tight stitching, were three initials, C.B.L., and beneath them, in all capital letters, Worthy. She took it without speaking, running her fingers over the thread. Her breath caught in her throat. "You made this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. "For you, because you are." A profound, rich silence hung between them. Then she spoke the thought that had lived in her heart since that first night of frost. "You chose us," Seraphina said, pulling the shawl close to her chest. "When you could have walked away, when the storm was raging, you chose us. Why?" Elias turned from the sunset, meeting her gaze. He stepped forward, took her hand gently, and looked into her eyes. There was no grand proposal, no flowery declaration, just the quiet, absolute weight of his truth. "A man finds his life's work in the middle of a blizzard sometimes," he said, his voice low and firm. "My work is here now." That night, with the fire crackling and the mountain silent, they exchanged their vows. There was no gold, no priest, no music, only the low light of the hearth and the sound of the wind settling into the pines. Elias offered her a string of smooth, carved cedar beads, one for each of the girls, tied with twine. He looped them over their tiny wrists as they slept. For Seraphina, he offered nothing but his hand. She took it, and in doing so, took everything that mattered. They were married by the fire, by the mountain, and by the undeniable, stubborn fact of their survival. Seraphina Thorne and Elias Vance built a life from the ashes of a cruel past, proving that the greatest strength is found in quiet, unyielding commitment. Their legacy is the laughter echoing on Stoker Peak. If this story of defiance and enduring love resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope survives even the harshest winters.